I was sitting alone in the living room, waiting for my best friend to return, when the door unexpectedly opened. It wasn't him. It was his mother. What happened next would change the way I looked at life, family, and loyalty forever. Her soft voice, her inviting smile, it all seemed innocent at first. But that night, in the kitchen, everything we thought we knew about boundaries unraveled in a single moment. Alex and I met during a neighborhood soccer tournament one warm fall afternoon. The crowd cheered as we played, the crisp scent of freshly cut grass mixing with the aroma of hot dogs from a nearby vendor. Alex was a fantastic defender, and I played goalie that day. After the match, we struck up a conversation and discovered we had a lot in common. From that moment, our friendship flourished. Alex lived in a spacious, picturesque home in Meadowfield with his family. His father was a stern, business-oriented man, always dressed sharply in a suit and perpetually away on work trips. I had seen him only a handful of times, his presence more of a distant authority than a warm figure. In stark contrast, Linda, Alex's mother, was the heart of their home. She had a way of making everyone feel welcome, her nurturing nature evident in her warm smiles, hearty cooking, and curious questions about school, sports, and life in general. Linda wasn't just a homemaker. She was an artist of domestic life. Her pies were legendary, and her presence exuded an effortless grace. Even when the house was bustling with Alex's friends, she managed to create an atmosphere of comfort and warmth. For me, a kid who often found solace in quiet spaces, her home was a haven. That Friday, Alex called me with excitement in his voice. He'd gotten a new console and insisted I come over to play. The weather was gloomy, cold rain tapping on my window, so I quickly agreed. By the time I arrived, Linda had left for a weekend trip to visit a friend, and his father was, as always, away on business. We played for hours, the sound of our laughter filling the room. Eventually, Alex remembered he needed to run into town to pick up some college paperwork. "I'll be back in no time," he said, grabbing his coat. Left alone in the living room, I sank into the couch, scrolling through the channels, unaware of the events about to unfold. When the key turned in the lock, I expected to see Alex, but instead, Linda walked in, her arms full of grocery bags and a look of surprise on her face. Linda was surprised to see me sitting there, but quickly smiled, brushing off the encounter like it was nothing out of the ordinary. "I thought you boys had gone out," she said, placing the grocery bags on the counter. I explained that Alex had left for a quick errand, and she nodded, offering me tea while she unpacked her things. Her movements were unhurried, graceful, as if she carried the weight of the world but made it seem effortless. I joined her in the kitchen, where she brewed a special herbal tea and set out some of her famous homemade cookies. As we sat at the small, rustic table, Linda began to share stories about her youth. She painted vivid pictures of late-night study sessions, carefree days of laughter, and her dreams of becoming a teacher. Her voice was soft and melodic, and the way her eyes lit up with each memory made me feel like I was peering into a part of her life that even Alex might not have known. But beneath the warmth of her words, there was an unspoken tension I couldn't ignore. I felt it in the way her gaze lingered just a second too long, in the slight catch in her breath when she reached for her teacup. The cozy kitchen, with its dim lighting and the sound of rain tapping against the windows, suddenly felt charged, as though something significant hung in the air between us. Then it happened. Linda got up to close the curtains, shielding us from the outside world as the storm intensified. I stood to help, intending to bring my cup to the sink. As we passed, our bodies brushed against each other. It was so slight, so innocent in theory, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't rationalize. She staggered, and instinctively, I reached out to steady her. My hand lingered on her arm, and instead of stepping back, she looked up at me. Her eyes searched mine, filled with something I couldn't place, vulnerability, maybe, or curiosity. My heart raced, my mind clouded by an inexplicable pull toward her. The rational part of me screamed to step away, to break the moment before it spiraled out of control. But I couldn't, and neither did she. That night, her presence stayed with me, even after I left the house. It wasn't just her kindness or the way she carried herself. It was the realization that she was more than Alex's mother or the woman who baked pies and kept the house running. She was human, with emotions, desires, and secrets of her own. From that point forward, I began noticing little things that had once seemed insignificant. The way her laughter had a melancholic undertone, as if hiding an unseen sadness. The moments when her gaze would drift, lost in thought, before snapping back to the present. I started questioning everything. Was I imagining the tension, or had something shifted between us? Alex, blissfully unaware, continued to treat me as his closest friend, inviting me over often. But each visit became more complicated, the boundaries between right and wrong blurring further. I found myself both drawn to and terrified of the emotions stirring within me. And then, there were the red flags, her subtle glances, the unspoken words that hung in the air, the way her demeanor softened when we were alone. It was as if we were playing a dangerous game neither of us fully understood. With each passing day, the weight of those moments grew heavier, and I couldn't help but wonder, was I imagining all of this, or was something forbidden beginning to take root? It started with fleeting moments, quick glances that lingered too long, accidental touches that sent shivers down my spine. Linda and I never spoke about what happened that evening in the kitchen, but it hung between us like an invisible thread, pulling us closer with every encounter. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking, but deep down, I knew that something had changed. The following week, Alex invited me over again, this time for a movie night. I almost declined, the guilt of my growing feelings weighing heavily on me, but he insisted. When I arrived, Alex was setting up the living room, and Linda was in the kitchen, her back turned as she prepared snacks. She glanced over her shoulder when she heard me come in, her smile warm but guarded. Throughout the evening, I could feel her presence, even when she wasn't in the room. It was like my senses were tuned to her, every movement, every word she spoke, every time her laughter echoed down the hall. Alex, completely oblivious, joked and chatted as if nothing was amiss, but I found it harder and harder to concentrate. Later that night, Alex fell asleep on the couch, the movie credits rolling on the screen. Linda quietly entered the room, a soft blanket in her hands. She covered him gently, her motherly affection evident in the way she tucked the blanket around his shoulders. Then, she turned to me, her eyes catching mine in the dim light. "You're still awake?" she asked softly, sitting down on the armchair across from me. I nodded, unable to find my voice. The silence between us stretched, thick with unspoken words. "Finally," she said, "you've been quiet tonight. Is everything okay?" Her concern was genuine, but her tone held a depth I couldn't ignore. I tried to deflect, mumbling something about school stress, but she didn't seem convinced. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes searching mine. "If there's ever anything you need to talk about, you know I'm here, right?" The vulnerability in her voice broke something inside me. I nodded again, but the truth was, I couldn't talk to her. Not about what I was feeling, not about the thoughts that had consumed me since that night in the kitchen. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and longing. I began to notice the smallest details about her. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the delicate laugh lines around her eyes, the faint scent of her perfume that lingered in the air after she left a room. Each detail only deepened the conflict within me. Then, one rainy afternoon, Alex asked me to pick up some papers from his house while he was at work. I hesitated but eventually agreed, convincing myself that it was just a quick errand. When I arrived, the house was quiet except for the sound of rain tapping against the windows. Linda was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters. She looked up when I walked in, her expression shifting from surprise to something I couldn't quite decipher. "Alex isn't here," she said, setting the cloth aside. I explained why I'd come, and she nodded, motioning for me to sit while she went to find the papers. When she returned, she placed them on the table but didn't leave. Instead, she sat across from me, her hands clasped together. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us felt charged, as if every unsaid word and unacknowledged feeling from the past weeks had come rushing to the surface. Finally, she broke the silence. "You've been avoiding me," she said softly, her eyes fixed on her hands. I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to deny it, to brush it off as nothing, but another part of me knew she was right. I had been avoiding her, not because I didn't want to see her, but because I didn't trust myself when I was around her. I just thought, maybe it was better that way, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at me then, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and something else, something that made my chest tighten. "Better for who?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Before I could answer, she reached across the table, her hand brushing against mine. It was such a small gesture, but it felt monumental. My heart raced as I looked at her, the weight of everything we weren't saying pressing down on me. At that moment, the world outside ceased to exist. It was just the two of us, caught in a moment that felt both inevitable and impossible. I knew it was wrong, knew the line we were about to cross could never be uncrossed, but I couldn't bring myself to pull away. And when she leaned closer, her eyes searching mine for permission, I didn't stop her. The living room was dimly lit, the sound of rain outside providing a steady backdrop. Linda's hand still rested lightly on mine, and for a moment, neither of us moved. It felt like time had stopped, every sound muted except for the pounding of my heart. Her eyes searched mine, and in them, I saw a storm of emotions, fear, longing, uncertainty. Then it happened. She leaned in closer, her lips brushing against mine in a moment so fleeting, so tentative, it almost felt like a dream. But it wasn't a dream. The warmth of her touch was real, as was the weight of what we'd just done. The kiss was brief, yet it carried the force of weeks of unresolved tension, of feelings we'd both tried to suppress and failed. We pulled back almost immediately, the reality of our actions crashing down around us. She stood abruptly, her hand flying to her mouth as if to stifle a gasp. I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice trembling. This was a mistake. I wanted to say something, to assure her that she wasn't alone in this, that I felt the same turmoil she did. But the words wouldn't come. My mind was racing, torn between guilt and a desire I couldn't deny. Before I could respond, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway shattered the silence. Alex was home. Panic set in as Linda hurriedly adjusted her hair and smoothed her dress, her movements frantic. "Go to the kitchen," she hissed, her voice low but urgent. "Act normal. Please." I obeyed, my legs feeling like lead as I made my way to the kitchen. The door opened, and Alex walked in, shaking the rain from his jacket. "Hey. Didn't expect you to still be here," he said, his tone cheerful as he spotted me. I forced a smile, trying to act as casual as possible. "Yeah, just waiting for you," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. Linda appeared moments later, her composure restored, though her eyes betrayed her inner turmoil. "Alex, you're drenched," she said, her voice warm but slightly strained. "Go change before you catch a cold." Alex grinned, oblivious to the tension in the room. "Sure thing, Mom," he said, heading upstairs. The moment he was out of sight, Linda turned to me, her expression a mixture of desperation and resolve. "This can't happen again," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It was a mistake." "A terrible mistake," I nodded, though the knot in my chest tightened with every word she spoke. "I understand," I said, even though I didn't, not fully. All I knew was that the connection between us, as wrong as it was, couldn't be undone. The following weeks were a blur of avoidance and strained interactions. I visited Alex less frequently, each encounter with Linda filled with unspoken tension. Alex noticed my absence, but chalked it up to my new job and other commitments. "We'll catch up soon," he'd say, his tone light, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. But the truth has a way of revealing itself, no matter how deeply it's buried. It was a Saturday afternoon when everything came crashing down. Alex had invited a group of friends over for a barbecue, and I reluctantly agreed to join. The house was lively, filled with laughter and the smell of grilled meat. Linda moved gracefully through the crowd, her smile as warm as ever, though I noticed the flicker of unease in her eyes whenever our paths crossed. At one point, Alex called me into the house to help him find a bottle opener. As I searched the kitchen drawers, I heard a voice behind me. "We need to talk," Linda said, her tone firm but quiet. I turned to face her, my heart pounding. "Not here," I replied, glancing nervously toward the patio where the others were gathered. But she stepped closer, her expression resolute. "It can't wait," she said. Before I could respond, Alex entered the kitchen, his jovial mood instantly replaced by confusion as he took in the scene. "What's going on?" he asked, his gaze shifting between us. Linda stepped back, her composure faltering. "Nothing," she said quickly, her voice too high-pitched to be convincing. Alex frowned, suspicion clouding his features. "Are you sure?" he pressed, his tone sharper now. "Because it doesn't look like nothing." The room fell silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on all of us. I opened my mouth to speak, to defuse the situation, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, Alex's gaze locked onto mine, and in that instant, I knew he'd pieced it together. "No," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're joking. Tell me you're joking." "Alex, it's not what you think," Linda began, but he cut her off, his voice rising. "Not what I think. Then what is it, Mom? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you and my best friend have been sneaking around behind my back." His words hung in the air, sharp and accusing. Linda's face crumpled, tears streaming down her cheeks as she tried to explain, but Alex wasn't listening. His anger turned to me, his fists clenched at his sides. "You were supposed to be my friend," he said, his voice shaking with rage and betrayal. "How could you do this to me?" I wanted to explain, to apologize, to make him understand that it wasn't planned, that it wasn't something we'd intended. But there was nothing I could say to make it right. The damage was done. Alex stormed out of the kitchen, leaving Linda and me standing there in silence. The sound of the front door slamming echoed through the house, a final punctuation to the unraveling of everything we'd once held dear. The silence in the house after Alex stormed out was deafening. Linda stood frozen in the kitchen, her tear-streaked face pale and stricken. I couldn't move, couldn't think. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on me like a physical force. Every fiber of my being screamed that I should leave, but my feet refused to move. "I need to go," I finally managed to say, my voice hoarse. Linda didn't respond. She just stood there, staring at the door Alex had slammed shut moments ago. I left without another word, the echo of her quiet sobs following me as I stepped out into the cold, rainy evening. Over the next few days, the reality of what had happened hit me hard. Alex didn't call, didn't text. I tried to reach out, but every attempt went unanswered. He wasn't just avoiding me, he was erasing me from his life. The friendship that had once felt unshakable was now in ruins, shattered by a mistake that could never be undone. Linda, too, was unreachable. I didn't dare go back to the house, and she didn't make any effort to contact me. I imagined her dealing with the fallout at home, the arguments, the blame, the unbearable tension. Alex was her son, her family. Whatever connection we'd shared was secondary, a fleeting mistake that couldn't compete with the bonds of blood and years. For me, life became a series of empty routines. Work, home, repeat. The friends I had outside of Alex tried to draw me out, to include me in plans and distractions, but nothing felt the same. I couldn't stop thinking about that night, about the look of betrayal on Alex's face and the way Linda had collapsed under the weight of it all. Weeks turned into months, and eventually, I heard through mutual friends that Alex had moved out of his parents' house. He'd taken a room in a shared apartment closer to his college, leaving Meadowfield behind. The news hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to believe that time might heal the wounds, that one day we could sit down and talk, even if it was just to apologize and make amends. But now it seemed like that chance had slipped away. Linda's situation was more complicated. From what little I gathered, her relationship with Alex had been irrevocably damaged. He barely visited, and when he did, it was brief and distant. She'd become a shadow of her former self, retreating from the lively, nurturing woman I'd once known into someone quieter, sadder. The house that had once been a haven now felt like a mausoleum of what we'd all lost. One evening, months after the incident, I ran into Linda by chance at a small bookstore. She looked different, thinner, with dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't hide. At first, I wasn't sure if I should approach her, but when our eyes met, I saw a flicker of something familiar. Not warmth, exactly, but recognition. "Hi," I said awkwardly, my voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated, then nodded in acknowledgement. We stood there for a moment, neither of us knowing what to say. Finally, she broke the silence. "How have you been?" It was such a simple question, but the weight behind it was enormous. "I'm okay," I replied. "And you?" She gave a small, humorless laugh. "Surviving, I guess." Her eyes drifted to the floor. "Alex doesn't talk to me much anymore." I don't blame him. "I'm sorry," I said, though the words felt hollow. What was I apologizing for? For being part of the reason her life had unraveled? For not knowing how to fix it? For everything? She looked up then, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "We both made mistakes," she said softly. "But I think we both know it can't change anything." I nodded, the lump in my throat making it impossible to speak. We stood there for a moment longer, two people bound by a shared regret, before she turned and walked away. I didn't follow. What would be the point? Some things, once broken, can't be put back together. Over time, life moved on, as it always does. Alex found new friends, a new circle, and eventually stopped being a presence in my life entirely. Linda remained a memory, a cautionary tale I carried with me. I never saw her again after that day in the bookstore, but sometimes, especially on quiet evenings, I thought about her. About the woman who had been more than just my friend's mother. About the choices we'd made, and the lives they had altered forever. In the end, the fallout wasn't just about what we'd lost. It was about the realization that some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. And the weight of those decisions, of the people we hurt along the way, stays with us forever. Time, they say, heals all wounds. But some scars remain, etched deep into the fabric of who we are. The months turned into years, and while the intensity of the pain dulled, the memories lingered, a bittersweet reminder of choices made in a moment of weakness. Alex and I never reconciled. The friendship that once felt unbreakable was now a distant memory. Every so often, I would hear about him through mutual friends, how he was thriving in college, making new connections, carving out a life for himself far removed from the shadows of Meadowfield. I wanted to reach out, to explain myself one last time, but I knew it would only reopen old wounds. Some bridges, once burned, are better left untouched. Linda faded from my life as well. The brief encounter at the bookstore was our last, a final chapter in a story that had unraveled far too quickly. I often wondered how she was doing. If she'd found peace, if her relationship with Alex had mended, if she'd managed to reclaim some semblance of the warmth and vitality she once embodied. But those were questions I would never have answers to. For a long time, I carried the weight of guilt with me, a constant companion that colored my interactions and decisions. I found myself avoiding deep connections, fearful of making the same mistakes, of hurting someone else the way I had hurt Alex and Linda. It wasn't until I started therapy years later that I began to unpack the events of that time, to understand the reasons behind my actions and the lessons they held. One of the hardest truths I had to face was that I wasn't just a victim of circumstance. I had made choices, selfish, impulsive choices, that had consequences far beyond what I could have anticipated. And while I couldn't undo the past, I could learn from it. I could strive to be better, to build relationships rooted in honesty and respect, to never again let fleeting desires outweigh the value of trust. The moral of this story isn't a grand revelation. It's a simple, painful truth. Our actions, even in moments of weakness, have the power to shape not only our lives, but the lives of those around us. The boundaries we cross, the trust we betray, They leave marks that can't always be erased. And while forgiveness is possible, it doesn't erase the scars. In time, I found love, a relationship built on mutual respect and open communication. I shared my story with my partner, not as a means of seeking absolution, but as a way of being honest about the person I had been and the person I was striving to become. Their understanding and acceptance were humbling, a reminder that while we can't change the past, we can choose how we let it define us. Looking back, I see that time in my life as a turning point, a painful, messy, and deeply human chapter that taught me the importance of boundaries, integrity, and self-awareness. It wasn't an easy lesson to learn, but it was one that reshaped me in ways I'm still discovering. If there's one takeaway from this story, it's this: temptation is fleeting, but the consequences of giving in can last a lifetime. The lines we draw in our relationships aren't just rules. They're safeguards for the things that matter most: trust, loyalty, and the bonds we share with those we love. And so, life goes on. The past remains, but it no longer defines me. It's a part of my story, yes, but not the whole story. The choices I make now, the person I strive to be, those are what matter. And if I've learned anything, it's that the road to redemption isn't about erasing mistakes. It's about learning from them and moving forward, one step at a time. If you were in Alex's shoes, how would you have reacted? Could you ever forgive such a betrayal? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspectives. Don't forget to like this video if it resonated with you, and subscribe for more stories that challenge the boundaries of relationships and trust. Stay tuned for our next story. It's one you won't want to miss.